So welcome to the panel on autonomous organising and collective power, an economy of the common good. This panel sprung from the desire to have represented at this conference not just discussions that engaged with an imagination of a desired future, but also a conversation that acknowledged the incredibly inspiring work of people and projects that exist in the present moment. This panel speaks to a firm belief in prefigurative politics, where the goals we struggle for in the future are reflected in our actions now. The question that weaves in between the different presentations is, what does it mean to be member-led? Increasingly, we hear the terms grassroots used in mainstream political discourse, but the actual process that this form of engagement takes is still quite writ small in the discussion. Through inquiring into the lived experience of those within the struggle, we find not only knowledge production, but inspiration, alternatives, and the realization that another economic future is not only possible, but imminent. Whilst a radical government may create economic policy that betters the lives of the many, there also must exist a parallel project that mobilizes and unlocks our collective power to shape our common futures as communities, as workers, and as neighbours. It is my great and personal pleasure to present the four speakers on this panel. These three presentations showcase individuals and organisations engaged in a struggle that not only concerns the people they represent, but also offers us all examples of how we can support and care for each other based on horizontal solidarity. What they represent is not the character of the heroic neoliberal individual, but the collective power that exists within our communities. Lydia Hughes is a co-founder and co-editor of Notes from Below Workers' Inquiry Journal. Lydia works for the Independent Workers of Great Britain Union as the branch coordinator for the foster care workers branches. She also holds the position of lead organiser in the Justice for Cleaners LSE campaign with the United Voices of the World Union. She's also a dear friend and a personal inspiration. Simon Vickery and Lucy Gardner are key volunteers within the London Renters Union. The LRU formed out of a number of different housing activist groups, recognising the need for a members-led campaigning renters union in London that works towards decent, affordable and secure homes for all renters, using the power of collective action to support its members. The LRU is still a fledgling organisation, with one fully established branch in Newham and another forming in Lewisham this summer through the ongoing dispute at Eris House in Catford. Simon works in adult education as his day job, whilst Lucy works in museums, holding a strong belief in public spending. Both hold and practice the commitment to local organising as a means of collective liberation. Samia Anderson is the founder of our very own New School Economics. She is a Goldsmiths PPE graduate and Parliament liaison worker. As a campaigner and activist, she has been part of the production of the documentary film On the Ground at Grenfell, which has been screened all over the country, including in Parliament on the 6th month anniversary of the fire. She's a Grenfell volunteer working to gain justice for those affected by the tragedy, and it is our pleasure to welcome her back to Goldsmiths. We'll begin by hearing from Lydia, and then from Simon and Lucy, and then finally with Samir, and then we will move to the Q&A.
Wow, thank you so much. That's quite an intro. I feel flustered. So I'm an editor at an online socialist journal called Notes from Below. And we use a tool, a method called Workers' Inquiry. And when looking at the theme of this session, you describe mapping grassroots struggle and the construction of knowledge from below. So along that theme, I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, what Workers' Inquiry is, why it's our weapon of choice in building a socialist future, and secondly, how do we use it to organise? Because what use is it if we're not organising? I mean, that's our end goal, to organise towards socialism. So Workers' Inquiry. It combines knowledge production and organising, essentially. It creates useful knowledge about work, exploitation, class relations, capitalism, and often our housing situations outside of work as well. But all from the perspective of workers. So it's not this top-down kind of research that we'd find in academia. However, it does come in two forms. We've got from above research, which is about work, inquiring into the world of work, but using more traditional research methods. So it's the kind of research that we'd normally see. And then from below, which I'll focus on more today, seems more in keeping with the panel. And this normally happens through a process of co-research, which is worker-led, trying to inquire into the world of work from below, quite self-explanatory. So through workers' inquiry, we aim to uncover the class composition, because capitalist exploitation is not an abstract idea. It's particular, and it comes in material forms. This terrain is constantly changing. There's new technology, new work processes coming in all the time, movement of people, movement of capital, new industries springing up, old ones dying out. So we really want to analyze this new terrain. We want to find where capital is weak and where workers are strong. So we have 3 different parts of class composition, which I'll briefly run over before talking about how we apply them in a more practical way. The first is the technical composition. This is how work is actually organized, how we use our time, what we produce, what kind of managerial system governs us. And then the social composition, so how we are composed in society, what our lives are like outside of work, culture, family, how family relations set up. Something simple like the London Renters Union. What's our life like at home? Do we rent? Do we own our houses? It's incredibly important questions to be asking. And then the political composition, which comes out of these previous 2 parts of the composition. This is how workers organize politically, given the technical and social composition. Are they parts of organizations? Is it informal, formal kinds of organization? And there's this dynamic relationship between the 2, which produces an overall class composition, which is what we really want to find out. To put this in more practical terms, so we can think about it better, we can think about Deliveroo, and this is, everyone's talking about it at the moment. We've got a strike coming up, hopefully a national strike, a Deliveroo strike. And we can see here a big shift in the technical composition. So people are independent contractors, not a new thing, but now their work is mediated through platforms, which I'm sure they're talking about in the other talk. But this is a huge change in the technical composition. You're being organized by an algorithm, by an app. You don't ever come into contact with anyone who's from Deliveroo. And this seems really depressing. Like, how can people organize and fight against this? But from this, we get an all totally new political composition, where workers don't have to abide by these onerous trade union legislation. They don't have to ballot to go on strike. They simply just log off. And then you can very easily organize a strike without these trade union legislations. So that's a brief example of how they can interact. And they sound a bit abstract, these ideas, but how can workers' inquiry actually help us organize on the ground? Why is this a useful practice to use when organizing? And it's something we used in the LSE Cleaners campaign, and ongoing using it with cleaners at LSE. And this was what Sophia here as well, who organised the campaign with me. There was a 9-month-long campaign with lots of cleaners at LSE involved in a small base union called United Voices of the World. And after 7 days of strike action, 2 occupations and lots of other political activity, they're actually they are now in-house, so they're employed directly by LSE, which is a huge change from the outsourcing conditions they had before. Not only the conditions like sick pay and holiday pay, but feeling like they're part of LSE again. So there are 2 ways we've used it. Part of the first way is the immediate organising, and this is something that I'm doing now with one LSE cleaner. And very practically, this just means sitting down and we have conversations, and I just write and he just speaks. And we have conversations about, it sounds silly when you talk about it, but actually it's like you really come into contact with what's really going on in the workplace. And actually we found that one of the most important things going on, one of the hugest sites of struggle, is about unblocking toilets. And it sounds silly because we see these huge eruptive demonstrations about we want sick pay, holiday pay. But actually day to day, people are coming into conflict with their managers all about unblocking toilets. It's the most highly contentious issue. So by collecting all this research and creating this body of knowledge, we're finding out what the issues are in this workplace, and then writing it up into flyers, writing it up and producing bodies of research that we circulate through the workplace, potentially through a workplace bulletin that we can also share to other workplaces of cleaners, in order to create a kind of shared collective identity and diagnosis of what the problems are. Off the back of this, we can then start organising a campaign and encouraging people to join the union. And then secondly, it's the last little bit I'll say, is what I think the most important thing right now for Workers' Inquiry is that the trade union movement seems like it's falling apart. The density has fallen below 25% in the whole workforce. I mean, that sounds like quite a lot, but in no country where it's fallen below 25% density has it ever come above that before, again. And our major trade unions are in huge decline. They don't know where to go from here, I feel like. Maybe someone else has a different idea. But it seems like a dire situation. And we can look to these campaigns of these cleaners. I mean, in the last 20 years, we've been seeing some of the most tenacious waves of working class subordination in the cleaning sector. And this is with a backdrop of people saying migrants are unorganisable, migrants are suppressing wages. We can look to the reality of this and see it couldn't be more different. Actually, migrants in London are pushing up wages. They're organising every day for the London living wage. So that's why we must insist that the workplace is our starting point. These really successful campaigns should be our starting point. Because not only is clean space produced at LSE, but also these incredibly tenacious workers who are resisting every day. So we want to inquire into this specific success at LSE, and it's an ongoing process to find out how this has happened. How come in this situation where people are so precarious and have faced huge pressures at home and at work on their wages based on sick pay, have they been able to resist so successfully? And they're winning campaigns every day through these small unions such as IWGB and UBW. And hopefully we can replicate this success by producing this working class knowledge. That's what I would like anyway. I don't know if the major unions will listen just yet. But the introduction to this talk that's in the brochure said lots of the finding out this knowledge is about finding gaps, observing gaps. But I would say actually creation of this knowledge is observing strengths. Just as the refusal to unblock the toilets is a strength, a show of collective strength by the cleaners, or taking prolonged strike action. We need to understand these strengths and replicate them in that way. That's about it.
We now have Simon Vickery and Lucy Gardner from the London Renters Union.
Cool. Thank you. As George said in the introduction, we're sort of a relatively fledgling organisation, launched our first full branch in Newham in January, and we're sort of in the process of building a branch in Lewisham through some work in Catford specifically. Lucy's going to sort of talk about that in a bit of detail in a minute, but first of all I'm just going to sort of give a sort of introduction to the union and to kind of what we're for, I suppose. So yeah, what is the LRU for? Ultimately it's to shift the balance of power between landlords and tenants in London. So we're interested in making the private rented sector a viable place to live. We are focusing in particular on the private rented sector as opposed to social housing, partly because the PRS is growing so rapidly, It's sort of, I think, fairly recently just become the sort of majority, the tenure of the majority of people living in London. Also, because to some extent, some social tenants have degree of representation through things like housing associations, tenants associations. Often they're rubbish, of course, but the quality of them varies quite drastically. But there is a sort of perhaps some representation there. So we are focused on the private renter sector, and we want to make it a viable place to live. And we will sort of talk a little bit at the end, perhaps, about kind of some of the kind of broad brushstroke demands that we've been kind of thinking. But it's things like Enter Section 21, indefinite tenancies, rent controls. These are the kinds of demands that a London Renters Union is kind of thinking about. But beyond these kind of immediate demands, we're a radical union that wants a housing system in which everyone has access to decent, safe, secure, affordable housing, and in which homes are treated, in which they're held in common, not treated like financial assets. So it's not just about kind of picking a fight with landlords and winning fights with landlords. It's about getting rid of landlords completely. Or I guess in sort of the language of this, not as like a social class, not as individuals. So in the sort of language of the conference, it's like, it's not just about making sure that private rent tenants are treated justly, but it's about doing away with the whole injustice of being a private tenant. We're kind of convinced of the importance of building renter consciousness in doing this, and also kind of shifting some of the common sense assumptions around renting. When we've been building for the branch in Newham, we've obviously been knocking on doors, asking people kind of what are the problems you have as a renter, and actually very, very few people complain about their rent, despite the fact that most of them pay over 50% of their income, which just tells you how normalised it's become. People don't think of themselves, or even as renters, but they don't think of themselves as sort of put upon for the fact they pay so much money. That's one example of the kind of common sense. At present, a landlord's right to make profit from a property is, of course, it trumps a tenant's right to a secure home. And that's sort of obviously enshrined in law, but it's also just a kind of common sense thing around housing. It's common sense that tenants shouldn't have democratic control of their housing, even like a little bit. So we've been doing some organising in Catford. We've had meetings with the council and with a kind of management company that look after this particular block. Something we've really had to push for is the idea that tenants have the right to meet the management company that look after their block. That's something the management company was certainly not into, and something the council, something the Labour Council were definitely not into either. So while they kept telling us that it was unacceptable that the companies didn't want to engage, they also just said it's their prerogative. So that's a bit of common sense that we want to shift. In order to do this, we want an active membership. So we're a fighting union. It's about members working together to transform their own housing situation and each other's housing situations. That means turning membership into sort of collective campaigning. We made a decision quite early on that we didn't want to provide an advice service, that we wouldn't specifically have things like a phone line, or certainly not at this stage. It's partly about resources and capacity, but it's also that we believe in the possibility and the power of collective action to get big wins for renters. And actually we didn't want to put anything in place that would get in the way of getting people together and organising together in the same space. An active membership also means taking collective action on various different scales. So it might mean, and does mean, accompanying people one-to-one to meetings with landlords or to the housing office. It could mean 2 people sitting down to write a letter to a landlord, or 5 people sitting down to write that letter. It could mean 40 of you turning up at landlords, other business to kind of protest. It could mean a whole block of tenants going on rent strike. We haven't quite got to that one yet. We've done the other ones. So I guess the principle there is that collective action is the way we can use it to approach lots of, the full kind of range of different kind of issues that renters face. Active membership is about learning from each other as well. So it's empowering members to improve their own situations and to participate fully in the life of the union. So that means when we run meetings, we like to include elements of training. So training in housing rights, training people in how to facilitate meetings, how to do one-to-ones, which Lucy's going to talk about in a minute. But so it means you don't create this dynamic where there's the sort of service provision and people coming to the meetings and kind of getting that and then going. It's about kind of building the membership of the union in every kind of every time we meet. We're a democratic union, so that means members control the union and controls how the union chooses to use its resources. We had our first all-member assembly earlier this week, actually, which is a really exciting thing. And that was where we kind of came up with some symbolic demands, and that was a kind of process of shaping our kind of shared politics. But also, crucially, being a democratic union, it also means, as well as challenging the oppression that people face as renters, it means challenging oppression inside the union. So we challenge oppression in the way we organise, not just in what we organise against. And just finally, before I pass over to Lucy, we want to be a truly representative union. So that means being representative of London's diversity, but it also means recognising that it's often those whose voices are most frequently marginalised that get the shittest deal out of housing. We need to be aware of that whenever we organise.
I'll speak to you a bit specifically about Eris House in Catford, which is kind of a case study of what we've been doing in the Renters Union. And we're looking to build a Lewisham branch over the summer, kind of take what we've learnt from that building and sort of scale it up, as it were. Eris House is a building with 65 flats in it. It's a big mix of private renters and some people in temporary accommodation. And the building is just in huge decline. And all these people who live there with their families have just been living in really hellish circumstances. So we have huge problems with leaks, huge problems with damp, which is made worse by landlords actually cutting down all of the rooms and chopping down a normal-sized one-bed flat into a three-bed flat. And some of these rooms are just about the kind of legal size limit, but with all the damp that's in there, they're just unlivable. So that's sort of one side of the problems. You've also got windows in a huge sort of 10-storey block that are kind of either broken and falling apart, and you might fear of falling out of them, or you can't open them at all because they're broken. So just so many inherent problems. Another one is the heating system is so terrible it kind of heats up sections of the walls that it's on. So people are really, really, really freezing in the winter, but they want to put the heating on, but the heating's not safe. So the people that have been living there have been complaining for years and never getting anywhere. And people not only not listening, but actually trying to make those residents feel like they're a total nuisance and feel like the problems are their fault. In one of these tiny, tiny bedrooms, one of the housing providers came along and said, "Oh, you've got your bed and your wardrobe against the wall, that's why it's damp." And we were, everybody's like, where else are you going to put those things, because the room's so small? This damp is inherent, it's in the building. Everyone can see the problems that are there, but until actually you link those people together, the picture doesn't all come together, that these problems are so inherent. So, what have we done in the building? We sort of found out about some of these issues and started just to talk to people, really simply, door knocking and going around doing bits of phone banking and sort of gathering information. And information is really powerful here because obviously it links together all of these huge problems and paints a much more dangerous and scary story than if you're just looking at one person's flat. So we've been doing a lot of face-to-face organising. We've been gathering up members who are actually really, really, really keen to get the rest of the building involved as well. So already the moment we kind of stepped in there, we doubled our power and keep doubling it all the time by people learning what we're doing. One of the members actually spoke at the All-Member Forum the other day, and he said it was really nice because he felt like he was totally alone, struggling, and then it was like someone had tapped him on the shoulder and said, "You're not fighting this alone. This is a huge problem. This is a problem that a lot of renters face across the borough, across the city, across the whole country. And actually, we just need to get together and we need to learn how to help each other." And he said he felt really empowered by that. So some of the ways in which we've been building this sort of strength and building these relationships is making sure to undertake one-on-ones with members. So you don't just become a member and then kind of come to group meetings and always feel a little bit like you've not really said your story. We make sure that you have a one-to-one with someone else who's been involved a little bit longer than you. And we train people up in doing those one-on-ones as well. And they're really, really, really key in learning things about people, but also sharing your own experiences. Because we're all in the same boat with the renters union. And even if you're not actually a renter, the prices of the private rent centre and the price of housing will affect you in everything you do. So it's about kind of joining those people together. And I think sometimes people think they're coming along because they want to help out, and then they realise, oh, my situation is terrible as well. And actually, I was just sort of telling myself, oh, it's okay, you're all right, you're not as bad as some. But actually, when you look at the sort of the view of all these landlords and how much money they're making, in this particular flat, there's sort of really, really, really small, really bad condition flats, 2-bed flats going for, and they're paying £1,400 a month, which is sort of absolutely ridiculous, and just never doing anything to fix any of the problems. So we have brought everybody together, and as a result of sort of collective bargaining, we brought District Homes, who are sort of management company, and Lewisham Council to the negotiating table. We have sort of managed to get a few wins. So they said that sort of not been able to run and hide anymore, and not been able to patronise the residents and say their problems aren't real. They have actually said to us, okay, we understand these things that you've told us, you just need to tell us everything that's happening in each flat, and we will go into those flats and we'll fix them. This is what they've said so far. So they've agreed to fix the roof, they've sort of fixed some of the lifts in some of the communal areas, and done something about security in some of the flats. They've also fixed some of the really, really sort of imminent problems with wiring and leaks and things. So they've started, but we're going to just stay on them, and we're going to make sure going into winter that some of the problems with that heating is fixed, because at the moment some of those things don't seem like as much of a problem. But yeah, it's just been really a huge sort of collective group coming together, and I think the council and district homes are actually quite surprised by how organised we were. We'd done a lot of negotiation training before we went in. We'd gotten all our information together, and we've just recently set up an online complaints form so that if any resident writes to their housing provider, it's actually logged in a table as well. So we have pure evidence of what is and isn't being done, and we need to really keep our eye on it, and hopefully, and then escalate if we need to. But we're really, the residents who are there, really listening to them about what's important and what they want, and whether their lives are actually getting better or not, and whether a big public action would help that, or whether it would, we want to make sure that actually their lives are getting better, it's not just looking good for the union. So really it's just about building strength. We talk a lot about workers' rights and trying to collectivise those, but tenants so far haven't really done that on a big scale. And as part of the London Renters Union, we want to get everybody together, every single housing group in the city, every single activist group, and sort of build together so that landlords can't ignore us. And the government know it's coming. They know there's far more renters than there used to be, and I think they're quite scared, and they know they have to start listening. But even sitting in the meetings with the council and actually talking to them about the dangers in the building, still don't really feel like they're taking you seriously. And this is sort of just a small example of that. So.
Great, thank you. And now we have Samia Anderson, doing a discussion on Grenfell.
So I didn't know whether it was appropriate to clap or not, so I started clapping anyway, because I like the sound of what you're doing, and it really does sound amazing. But just to give you guys a quick intro as to how I got involved in campaigning for Grenfell. Last year, a few local young people, survivors from Grenfell Tower, began to document what was going on because of the coverage on the television, which we did not notice or did not feel like that was a proper reflection of what was going on the ground. The media was quick to point the finger at the resident whose refrigerator exploded. And behind the scenes, what wasn't really showcased in Grenfell is the fact that survivors and bereaved family members were hounded by the media. So you've got people who live in Syria, family in Syria, who were being, actively sought after by the media. That's just going too far. So what we did is we sat down with people who we knew, because we were actual people who lived locally to Grenfell Tower, and we had those discussions, and we really had a chance to explore what was going on in the way that the media couldn't, in the way that the media, for example, Channel 4 gets like really short sound bites of things. So Grenfell Tower itself exposed a massive flaw in the housing system, and it really did amplify what inequality meant in London. And it really did show the detachment between the establishment and the people. A system of poor, building regulation, whereby developers set the rules and manufacturers certify their own materials, and building control inspectors certify their own construction for developers, is a broken system. So what Grenfell has done on the ground is, force people together in a way that it was such an urgent issue that survivors and bereaved of Grenfell Tower immediately banded together, and they created something called Grenfell United. So Grenfell United is the main body of Grenfell, is the main representative body of survivors and bereaved from the Grenfell fire, making things happen behind the scenes. So the vast majority of Tower residents today are GU members, and GU itself has a committee elected. And they have made an active commitment to be entirely non-partisan. So non-party political, because in the beginning of Grenfell, the media were quick to party politicize the issue also. So what this did, this tragedy forced a space for people to get into a circle and say, okay, we don't want the media here, we don't want our lawyers here, we just need to get the people who are actually residents of Grenfell and the family members to sit down and figure out how we need to campaign for justice and what that actually looks like. So at that time, in the immediate aftermath of the fire, so much was unknown. Some people just wanted answers, and people wanted a dialogue with the people who were responsible for what had happened. So what this actually did is everyday people, like Shaheen, who's the chairman of GU, Ed Defern, who was one of the main people in the Grenfell Action Group, they got together and they said, we need to create a space. And soon after that, what was uncovered is, at the time, there was a lot of unrest and tension. So while there was protests going on in the forefront of Grenfell, people marching on the streets, Grenfell were inside trying to speak to people like Theresa May and the Queen, while all of those protests were going on right outside their doorstep. And all they wanted to know is what the hell is going on. So while people externally from the wider community wanted to protest and show the world, an effort which says we're not going to let this go, Grenfell United actually humbly just approached people and said, could you give us the answers? So going on into what Grenfell meant and what it actually signified, a lot of people have been calling it a politics of indifference, but Doreen Lawrence, who has become an advocate for Grenfell United through their active lobbying, she wrote a Grenfell piece on The Guardian, and she coined the term, she didn't coin the term, but she called it institutional indifference. And from there, a woman, a mother who has gone through the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, which has so many similar lines of inquiry as the Grenfell inquiry has, for her to speak out and say Grenfell was a symptom of institutional indifference, because people did exactly what they were supposed to do. People actively, while the regeneration was going on, said, okay, well, let's have meetings with the council, let's really, actively make a blog, and let's have our, voices heard. But Grenfell United reconceptualised what Grenfell looks like in the context of Grenfell, justice for Grenfell even. The people who, are outside the boundaries of Britishness, middle classness, are exposed to institutional indifference on a daily basis. And the question, who is London for, is what Grenfell, reiterated. Why are Grenfell survivors still not rehoused? Social housing tenants, are people being offered homes that are not fit for purpose across this country, even Grenfell survivors, which is why they are still unhoused. If you do not diagnose the issue itself, it's destined to repeat itself. So, in saying that, who is London for? This is the question presented by Anna Minton, David Madden, amongst others, who have, again, been advocates for Grenfell and actively speaking about Grenfell. But I like what Lydia said in the beginning of her talk. She said the workers' inquiry was the weapon of choice. Now, while I was in the midst of creating the documentary on the ground at Grenfell, myself and some NSE members here actually went to the community inquiry meetings with the actual panel of the official inquiry. And the community really wanted to know is, why are you qualified to carry out this inquiry? And in the beginning, there was so much tension that they couldn't even answer the question. It was very, very bizarre. But it just seemed really, clear to me that there needed to be an independent inquiry into the wider aspects of social housing in this country, which the official inquiry has omitted from its terms of reference. And in my opinion, that's just way too narrow. But the judge, Sam Orbick, has actually said there needs to be an independent inquiry external from Grenfell Tower. Now, what that actually signifies in the context of mobilising and creating some change is the fact that this inquiry will not be touching on the issues that affect, the context of, what Grenfell actually symbolises. So what Grenfell United have done, they, first of all, the actual practice of creating change has been in really just 3 steps, which is approaching Grenfell United to say, okay, well, you guys have created this body, now how do we move it forward? Is literally sitting with them and being a person who can advise process. And it's not just myself and other people. The experts have been brought in to actually advise them on how to move forward, and which has resulted in active lobbying of parliamentarians as well as local government. But NSE have invited me here to question how can we replicate this model, the Grenfell model of fighting for justice. And I'd like to say to you guys that through lobbying with Grenfell United, and not just Grenfell United, but also campaigning with Rethinking Economics, what it's taught me is that the basics of creating change is the fact that you cannot underestimate the strength of cross-party solidarity. So yes, we need the protesters to do what they do and yell because we need that, but we also need people on the inside who are informed, who have done the research, who have collectivized information and put it out there in the press. So there's a process. You need a dialogue with those in power. And tactful lobbying on both sides of the political spectrum needs to occur. So a unifying principle which your campaign stands on has to be approachable for all corners of society, or at least spun that way. And the next thing, which is a really bleak recommendation that I spoke to Gio about, is the fact that you actually do need the sympathy of the upper class, or should I just say the sympathy to take class out of the situation, sympathy from all corners of society for people who aren't so comfortable with that. But that's intrinsically and fundamentally somebody's side. Fundamentally, tied to cross-party solidarity, because on a humanitarian effort, it's not about who's on the left and who's on the right. When it comes to an issue like Grenfell, everybody needs to be united on it, because it's a national disaster and it needed a national response. And the last time I checked, the left and the right are a part of the nation. Anyway, so yeah, So what I've taken from all of this is that if you're living in a community that's been earmarked for regeneration or lived on a council estate or social housing, a lot of what's uncovered by the Grenfell tragedy or the Grenfell action block sounds familiar, or, the London's Renters Union. So Grenfell has woke people up, and after Grenfell, people can not allow this to happen again. There are different campaigns across the country that are continuing to knowledge share. And I hope that, Grenfell United can stand as an example for how to, bring things together. So one of the things beneficial about being in this room today is the fact that you guys can connect and work together to figure out what's happening in different campaigns and what resources each person in this room have actually leveraged to create change on whatever campaign they're working on. So I suppose that this is what this discussion is exactly for. So the NSE has been very successful in generating a community of economic thinkers, and I love seeing people passionate and so passionate to miss the England match today and even miss the awesome sunshine that's going on outside. So well done for you guys for being here. But I actually encourage you and everybody sitting here to not take this position for granted, because we really do need to utilize spaces like these to drive conversations about issues that desperately need change.
Thank you so much. I have questions for you all, but I will probably start with one. But everyone on this panel is a friend of mine, basically. And I have invited them here because I'm interested in everything they do. So I will open up a few questions after I have my turn first. So me and Samaya talked about this yesterday, this idea of sympathy. And what it means and what we can, because you were talking about how the sympathy is a sad fact of the Grenfell case, that it was required to be able to have that. And when we spoke about it, we began to discuss how, whilst the idea of that sympathy was a sad reality within the Grenfell case, what the sympathy did was allow the space for the community to engage itself and use what it had within it to organise itself. The Grenfell community didn't exist after the fire. The Grenfell community existed long before the fire, as did all of the issues with the housing the issues that were in the Grenfell Tower. And what's interesting in the Grenfell case is if you go down to that site and you see the community organising in the actual space that's been transformed around the tower to a community space, is when a community is given that space to organise, that it does it. There is an imminence for this kind of community engagement within our communities, and we just need to work out, and that's what I'd ask you, is how do we take that understanding that we get from Grenfell and activate that in further campaigns?
So I think ultimately what it boils down to is the fact that people, when they know that an issue, for example, the place in which you live is so important to people, and I think the more you understand that you can come together in spaces that, and say, me to, things start to happen, and ultimately I think that social media and the way that we communicate today has been a massive part of that. People actively, using Facebook and different Facebook groups to, even though it's problematic, to have those conversations and say, this is where we're meeting, we need to meet now, bring your family member who's been affected by Grenfell, and let's try and forge some kind of, change. And people actively voted on what they wanted to campaign on. So the three main asks for what they were going to approach the government with. And this was, in the first 6 months of the fire, or the first 6 months after the fire. So I feel like that's what people can take from Grenfell. And I didn't want to say the sympathy of the upper class to make it about class politics, because this is not just about class politics, because what people don't actually realise is people from Grenfell Tower were not just, poor people or immigrants, or, people have this, picture in their head of what people at Grenfell lived like. No, people were actually doctors, lawyers, had family members who, were in corporate bodies, and, that needs to shift as well. I think that kind of perception also needs to shift, and hopefully, I hope coming up to 13 months on that people actually get it. But yeah, I think that's a question that the audience needs to feed me back on, because I'm not sure.
I don't know if any of you want to speak, or should we open up? Does anyone have any questions at all from the audience? The lady in pink, and then...
Thank you for those presentations. They were just absolutely fascinating and encouraging, and I just think we need some encouragement. It's not a question actually, it's just a comment, and you may well know about this kind of area of thinking, because you all know far more about this than I do. But there's been some quite interesting research and writing in relation to planning by an organisation which you may have heard of, the Town and Country Planning Association, and people like Hugh Ellis, who has recently penned a report called Planning Out Poverty. I haven't read it yet, but I've heard him speak a couple of times, and he's absolutely fascinating on sort of the way the planning system and planning principles can be used to improve housing and improve social spaces, and improve the lot of many people who would otherwise suffer. And he particularly talks about problems with permitted development, which is essentially development which is unregulated and which allows sort of old office buildings to be turned into flats, and which he describes as creating the slums of the future. So you look as if you know about this already, but I just wanted to contribute that thought in case it sort of fitted into things that you're thinking about and would be a useful area to make connections with and for extra information.
We'll take one more question, then we'll do the answers.
Thank you. I guess my question is mostly for Lydia, but it'd be interesting to hear the whole panel's thoughts on it, particularly about, given that you work for the trade union, I wonder if you could speak about how you try to grow membership with young people. Particularly, or if you don't work directly in recruitment, what are the stories you hear from the young people who do join you? Because I do think the declining rates of unionisation is extremely worrying for our generation, in the same way that so is the worryingly slow rates of people taking up pensions, because A, they don't know anything about it, or B, they're like, why should I save for 40 years when I'm paying now? But yeah, so I guess I'd be interested to hear your experiences about that.
Yeah, maybe let's go with those first. They seem like quite big ones.
Just to respond to that point about, I wasn't actually aware of that, so thanks. What I was nodding my head about is Eris House in Catford is an old office block. So it was built in the 1970s, award-winning at the time, apparently, brutalist office block. Was converted illegally, and then, as is often the case, subsequently got its kind of planning approved. And apparently would now have listed status if it wasn't for the kind of botched job that was done particularly on the inside. Yeah, I mean, just something to sort of flag there, particularly about Eris House, is we've ended up doing work there because there's a lot of private rented, a lot of tenants currently in the private rented sector who are being evicted from Eris House, so that many, particularly Lewisham Council, but other councils too, can get contracts with the landlord to use it as temporary accommodation. So there's, I suppose we have this, I mean, I haven't looked into it very deeply. I suspect this is the case, and increasingly going to be the case in London, that really, really bad housing stock is going to be used for temporary accommodation because the landlord knows they have a guaranteed rent. If you go on like Lewisham's website, they've got a whole bit there that's like, hey, why not come and be a landlord for our, why not get, we'll have a contract with you for temporary accommodation, and the deal is you always get, you'll always get your rent on time. So yeah, it rings really true. Definitely.
Should I go on to second?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, growing membership amongst young people, really, really tricky one. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the average age of a member of a TUC union is 57, 55, 55, 57, something like that, isn't it? I mean, which doesn't bode well for the future because these people are coming up to retirement, then they won't be in unions anymore. But I personally work with foster care workers who are all kind of a certain age. Don't want to be rude to the membership. But it's true that these younger unions, very small unions in London, seem to be organising young people a lot more effectively. And I would really chalk that down to taking action, I think. I think young people actually want to take action. And there's this very kind of, this knowledge that people keep replicating in big unions, which is that, you know, striking is our last resort. We don't take it lightly. We're not troublemakers. We'll try everything before then. And actually, you go to these small unions, and it's the first port of call. We say we know we have power in the strike. We know we have power in collective action, and that's where young members get empowered. They get empowered to join unions and to take action. Doing these negotiations and feeling like you're not part of this process, not having this confrontation with your boss, is hugely disempowering, and we find young people are just slipping away from it. But there's also a huge issue about education. I speak to most of my friends from back home and say, oh, I work for a trade union. They're like, oh, what's that? I honestly never heard of it before. Never even heard of a trade union, and you see that so often. I don't know if anyone's heard of this new app that the TUC have come out with. It's to get young people to join a union. So it's, I can't remember what it's called. Can I remember? Smart Work or something like that. Something embarrassing. So they're running a 1,000 people pilot program, and you download the app and it gives you career advice. So this is supposedly, they asked lots of young people what they wanted, and they said they wanted to get ahead in their careers. So the answer was, let's give them career advice, not tell them that this is a union project, and then at the end say, hey, why don't you join a union? And young people have to be tricked into joining a union? Well, actually, I think they don't. When you explain what a union is and that you can fight with your colleagues to get better conditions, I don't think young people are inherently opposed to that. I think they don't know about it. I mean, I really think this, my generation is the first generation where our parents weren't really in unions. I mean, some people's were, but across the board, lots of people's parents weren't. It's not something that we've known about or grown up with or, come into contact with much, is my analysis. Anyone else?
I'd just like to push you on, actually, something, which is within the IWGB and the role of bureaucracy within trade unions, and how bureaucracy, how the avoidance of bureaucracy, which seems to be a constant loophole that unions or these institutions have to jump through to be able to be legitimised, and how the IWGB notoriously traverses the use of bureaucracy.
Yeah, I think it's a kind of similar point to what I was making just now, is that people feel disempowered at work. Work is so, especially these precarious jobs, especially mediated through apps. So lots of our members at IWGB are Uber drivers, Deliveroo drivers. It's this hugely disempowering situation when you're getting told what to do by an algorithm, and then you try and complain, and you talk to an automated service, and then you have to keep complaining before you can speak to anyone who's real. So this hugely disempowering. So the structure of the union has to kind of compensate for that, I think. And I think people like to feel like they're organising and controlling a campaign. And because we're so small, I think it's easier. I'd like to say there was some kind of blueprint for how these big unions could empower their members to actually take control of the union, but it seems a bit far beyond that. But I think it's definitely the importance of having member-led campaigns, having campaigns that members feel like they have control over, and having elected officials they feel like they can recall, not these kind of dynasties that are in charge of these big unions, who seem so far removed from what members actually think, what they actually want. And part of that is having a big staff, a big permanent staff who do wield lots of power. And I mean, I work at a union, so. But yeah. Be interesting to think how you're thinking about it in terms of London Renters Union. I know you employ people too. It's a difficult relationship to, and one of the best models that I saw talking to people in Brazil was that members from the workforce would do their term or work for the union for a year, but would always be recalled back to the workplace, or would work one day still in the workplace. So you still maintain that accountability. You can't do something that basically messes over all your colleagues because you have to go back to that workplace and face the consequences, and you're not removed from that by some other relation. But yeah.
I think it would be probably just trying to devolve power so that the London Renters Union wants to be city-wide and a lot of people, but actually it's going to be focused in branches. So I kind of forgot to mention that sort of key of each branch will be regular branch meetings. And I think we have a sort of strategy for setting up a branch, so you can't just say, oh, I'm a branch in Walthamstow, and that's that. We have to kind of certain amount of door knocking and linking with other groups that you have to do before you become a branch. But I think then the hope is that each branch then really is member-led and might go in slightly different directions. And so I think really it's the problem when you're trying to make one decision with too many different people. So I think that as we grow, we're going to try and sort of do that in each of the branches, and it might be that somebody's problem in Southwark is different to in Islington.
Is there any more questions? We'll go with Sari, and then you, and then Sarah.
Hey, yeah, thanks. This is so fascinating. We've talked first thing this morning about precarity, and obviously that goes with work and housing and all these different things, and so many of these things that you're talking about seem to chime into that. And I'm part of my local Labour branch. It was really interesting because at a CLP AGM we elected a new youth officer, and she made a really interesting point, which was one of the big problems she's found herself and with friends and that is that she's about joining in with a local Labour Party, for instance, but could be anything, like whether it was a union or whether it was something trying to get some power, basically how much never being anywhere, how much the transience of life, whether it's always moving house so often, never putting, what you were just saying, never putting roots down in either work or whatever it is, situation, actually just dissipates so much power and so much organising potential. And so she was talking about this problem and how to that she wants to set up some kind of cross-London network so that if people are moving branches, there's a way to welcome them back in. And you were talking about organising branches, and that is one of the problems. Someone turned up last week and they were like, I never thought about coming to a branch because I thought I don't know how long I'm going to be here and blah, blah. And for me, as a precarious worker for many years, I didn't know that I could join a union because I thought there's no union for me. I'm not a teacher, I'm not a doctor, there's no union for me. But then I discovered someone said, oh, well, basically anyone can join Unite Community or whatever. So I was like, oh, well, okay then. Don't know exactly what they do, but I'm paying some money to a union. But do you know what I'm saying? So I wonder, probably I'm not even eligible to be that anymore, I don't know. But I wonder what your reflections might be on crossing that problem, which isn't for everyone. As you said, there was a community in Grenfell before, and now there still is, but definitely is a problem in London and around. And that's for everyone.
Do you want to?
So I was a bit late for this panel, and I don't know whether you touched these topics, but I was thinking that how do you see this concept, autonomous organising and collective power? Do you see them very separate things or very united things, or anyway? And also, the title also has a common good in it, and philosophers have debated thousands and thousands of years what is that common good, and I'm asking who is going to run the debate and what is the common good. and often it's the charities who try to highlight a new common good, let's say, and how we see charities is that like, charities and unions are doing the job that governments are not doing or not doing well. Anyway, so I just wanted to throw in the idea of how you define these kind of key moments of the key terms in the panel. Thank you.
So,
this is sort of following from what Sari said, but I was just sort of thinking about in terms of the precarious aspects, like how in terms of housing you can kind of resist the sort of geographic dispersion that happens. So I just remember looking at like infographics that came out of the Haygate estate, and you can see how far that those people have come removed from the city, and obviously we're in a process of London expanding, massively, and I can imagine, at Grenfell the same thing's happening. Not only is this accommodation temporary and it's cramped, but I can imagine it's not around the Grenfell area. So these kind of, although it's really important to hold these traditional sort of community acts of coming together and collective action, and I really would like to respect the idea of the London Renters Union not having these kind of phone lines, which kind of can often remove that. There is then this other issue of like, what happens to those people that don't get captured into this community organising, and how do we sort of make sure their story's not lost? Same sort of thing along sort of migrant lines, like, you might not know that family next door, and suddenly the next day they're being sort of forcibly removed. And how do we try and sort of also contain those narratives within this organising as well?
So I don't really have expertise on this through, Grenfell related stuff, but I would say just through me going to my own local community meetings with councillors and my MP and the police force and whoever else, what's really effective is where people have, like, for example, you've got districts, you've got branches. I think what's really, really good is to keep knowledge, going, is to have like representatives for each street. Do you know what I mean? So you could take it to like a borough aspect, and so that people aren't lost. That representative for a street, for example, needs to communicate when things are happening and just putting information through people's doors, for example, like things like this, because you've got WhatsApp groups, you've got Facebook groups of like local people who are talking about the issues and how to really challenge it, and things that go on like that. But I think what could be really effective is if you have people who are actively trying to target people and have dialogue. So
can I just answer that one about sort of people having to move frequently? Because I think that's obviously is a sort of relatively new organisation. It's not something that's happened loads, although obviously in a few months it has happened. People have already moved because they do. I think it's really important for the union that we regularly have these spaces that are all member spaces, or that are, as far as possible, are all member spaces. So several times a year having assemblies at which, as I say, we had one earlier this week, where people can come together, and in this instance we sort of ended up we would break into groups and have discussions around what would you like your housing to be like ideally, what are the biggest problems with your housing at the minute, how would you like to organise yourselves in the future, and that helped to kind of shape a sort of a kind of collective and shared politics. But it also meant people just know, now there's some people who live in Catford who've met people who live in Newham, and like there's this sense, it isn't although, as Lucy says, a lot of the work of the union will be focused at a real kind of branch level, we still need to make sure we get people from other bits of the city in the same room, as far as possible. Another thing, just to add to that, is that we haven't really talked much about our structure, but we have a series of working groups that kind of do things like kind of outreach or comms, so looking after kind of the website, or had a working group that kind of put together the model rules and all that stuff when we were setting up. And these are people from all over the city, so there are actually a lot of the work of sustaining the union as a hopefully large organisation is done by people who live in quite different places. Obviously, that's sort of, those people self-select, so they tend to be people with more time and whose lives are less precarious. So that's an issue. But there are, that's one way in which people from members from different bits of London can kind of, spend time together and forge those kind of personal links.
I think to add as well is just to say, obviously, a lot of the reasons that people do move is because landlords are being crap or hiking rents and stuff. And actually, I suppose the long-term goal is that people aren't made to do that so much, and that they do have this kind of right to community. And so I think sort of longer-term or indefinite terms for renting and things might actually start to kind of stop that a little bit. And people, I think, being able to have like these 1-year tenancies, and then landlords can kick you out, obviously is just hugely sort of instrumental in gentrification of an area. And actually, I think if we can really put the lid on that, that will really start to help things like that. And not only, and then also stop the council from having to subsidise rents in that area so much as well. So it's trying to look at the long-term causes of all those things and trying to stop the root causes rather than just deal with the results.
Yeah, I think I'd like to chime in there actually, in terms of, because I feel like your question was actually more directed at me than the panel. They're saying they didn't actually have a hand in phrasing the title. What we've discussed here, I think, and what the common good refers to in the title, can be seen in what we did. I'm a member of the London Renters Union at our all members meeting, which is where one of our amazing workers, who's employed by the union, Amina, when we engage firsthand, we did a comical name game that brings the whole union together, and it gives us into a common space. We have food that brings us into a common space, and what each of these different projects show is that the common good is not necessarily a defined product in terms of a piece of legislature, a piece of a win in terms of housing rights. The process is the common good. The development of a process that really facilitates a member-led organisation is the common good, and that's the product that the talk and the common good in the name of the title was directed at.
I think I can address the first two. I mean, there's a lot more nuanced answer than I was going to say. I was just going to say communism. But autonomous organising, collective power. I think you touched on it a bit earlier, but the branches of our union are semi-autonomous and building. So I don't see the two as being in conflict, and building collective power. But you can see yourself as autonomous from bosses or the state or other big institutions. So I think we can go through that theme and not forget it, hopefully, when the union grows. But precarity, that's interesting point about precarity and shifting around, because it's something that it's just a pitfall of organising precarious workers. There's turnover. But so many people say that's why it can't be done. That's why lots of people don't even bother organising, people in the hospitality sector or delivery riders or whatever, because there is this fast turnover. They think it can't be done. But I don't really have the answer to it, but all I can say is that even though there's such a fast turnover of the delivery riders, there's still collective organising going on all the time. And actually they have these WhatsApp groups in each region. I'm sure you might have read about it. So they're organised into regions, and there's an ongoing WhatsApp group all the time. People come and they go, but this is something that we just see that remains. And these groups can be mobilised incredibly fast when a new policy is brought in or when the work conditions change, and they still manage to stay mobilised. So it's kind of, I don't totally understand it, but it's something worth inquiring into. But yeah, so there's hope even in precarity. And I remember when in my first year at LSE, I went to the Unison rep and said, "Oh, we really want to help organise the cleaners or the security guards. How can we get involved in workers' campaigns?" And he was like, "Oh, they're too precarious. They're never going to be able to organise. They're too divided based along lines of ethnicity. I'm not even going to bother, basically." And then 2 years later, we're having these spectacular strikes, and it's happening. So I kept asking myself, how is it that these workers who are so precarious are so much more militant and radical and willing to put everything they have on the line more than more secure workers? I don't know, but it seems to be we can't underestimate people and write people off. Yeah.
I'll take the last round of questions now because we've got 5 minutes. Lady here and Henrique. So do you want to go?
Yeah, I want to ask, sort of pick up on a few things around sort of voice and representation and narratives that have come out. And I was actually originally going to ask maybe a sort of more question around the kind of wider narratives and how important you see influencing the kind of, for instance, a media narrative being for your organisation, your campaigns. So you touched on this a little bit with the, obviously, Grenfell being massively misrepresented, or Grenfell residents being very misrepresented in the media. But I was also thinking, when Lydia, you were saying about how, you sit down with workers and they just talk and then you write down and then that kind of informs you. And that sounds kind of similar to what you're doing at the Renters Union, really with the one-to-ones and with all the conversations kind of very much informing, everybody's experience is informing what you're doing, but then just when I had already sort of decided to ask on this, you brought up this theme around kind of outreach and communications officers type of, maybe that's not exactly how you'd word that post. But I was wondering how you kind of, each of you in your campaigns kind of navigate these issues around representation and in a way, like you say, often the people who have the time to put into the outreach and into the messaging are not necessarily the most precarious and the most effective. And I guess that is the case also with, for instance, Grenfell survivors or if you, Lydia, as a union worker, sit down with very precarious migrant workers. I'm also coming at this, I'm a researcher and a freelance journalist, so this is kind of constantly sort of issues that I'm kind of trying to navigate in my work, wanting to amplify people's experiences, people's voices, but always having a lot of questions around what's the right way to do that without imposing, being a white middle class person, for instance, or other kind of sort of filters that I've got. So I just wanted to ask your thoughts on that, those themes.
Henrique.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was really interesting and very encouraging too. I suppose I'm one of these old foggy people who engage in strikes in old-fashioned as does Victoria here. But on a serious note, what I'm quite struck by, and that is not a criticism, that is more something that I would like to be meant as a kind of comment, is what are the connections that you make with what went before you and what happens elsewhere? Because all 1, 2, 3, 4, counting Georgia's, but 5 of you have been very London-centric and very much talking from a very cosmopolitan, very metropolitan, very hyper-diversity kind of discussion. And I would like to see, you do not necessarily have the answers, I guess, but what have you learned from elsewhere? Whether it's the past, whether it's a different place, whether this is probably also looking beyond the UK.
Maybe we'll start with that question and go to Lydia, because I think you will have the better experience about that with the foster care branches, right?
So something about outside of London. I mean, I think it's a huge tendency, especially in these small, very young unions, to be we're doing it all for the first time, and no one's ever done class struggle before us. Wow. And I really try not to get wrapped up in that narrative, but often find myself replicating it. But there is an amazing, rich history, And I have certain friends who do more like historical research, which also expands outside of the UK. And if we think about the kind of cleaning sector in London, we have to look back at this amazing lineage. And it actually started with the Latin American Workers Association. Lots of the organisations that exist now exist within this lineage. And you can go back even further to see people's experiences in their country of origin and how that affects the struggle going on at the moment. So it's an amazing, fascinating part of research, and yeah, I would love to talk about it more with you after. I could probably talk about it for ages. But yeah, I completely understand your point, definitely.
Maybe you'd like to talk more about us. I mean, we're affiliated with them.
Yeah, well, obviously, we're fairly London-centric. We have, in terms of, so we have links with and are in fairly constant communication with Acorn, who are obviously a renters union based in lots of different places outside London. We've learned from them quite directly. We've also decided there's some things we want to do a bit differently as well. But we've certainly learned a lot from them. In terms of kind of immediate, I don't know if the predecessors is the right word, but the people who sort of were instrumental in setting up the union are definitely the people who've already been involved in housing groups. So a lot of like the Radical Housing Network in particular has been a big kind of sort of mover behind the union. We're also, having lots of conversations with groups like Housing Action Southwark and Lambeth, and kind of learning from taking a cue from how they've organised successfully for the last few years. In terms of kind of longer historical view, I guess obviously there are examples of kind of rent strikes in the UK, in Glasgow and sort of Stepney in the 30s. But also, I suppose we're aware that we don't want to get caught into this thing of like we're doing it all for the first time, but also tenants haven't organised successfully as a union before, like in quite the way that we want to do it. Obviously, Acorn are doing it elsewhere with lots of success. So I hope we are learning from what people have done, but also we're aware of like the challenges of doing something that is a bit different as well, and that's a bit terrifying.
Yeah. But perhaps, Maya, you could very briefly address the question on narratives, because we are very nearly done at time.
So I would say I'm really glad that you brought the attention to things going on outside of London and worldwide, because housing is an issue that affects people worldwide, especially taking into consideration the financial economic crash of 2008. So it does make a lot of sense to create some kind of hub or organisation which thinks about things that are going on. What are the struggles in New York? What are the struggles in London? And how can we actually learn from these things? I mean, I think what it boils down to is people who have the resources to do these things. And there are, authors and journalists who document these processes and make it available to people. And then it's kind of just left there in this kind of ether. But I think one of the things that we need to also think about is enabling, conversations around different cultures as well, because I like the fact that there are people who are doing outreach, but how do we, reach out to people? It's not even how do we, but we need to reach out to people who have different life experiences than us. It makes so much sense to, because, their struggles are maybe somewhat different to the majority of people who are, residents or whatever. But I think what I've learned through organising with Rethinking Economics and Save the Children also before getting involved with Rethinking Economics is the fact that regional hubs make a lot of sense. So when we're talking about unions and renters unions, I think you guys need to expand regionally. And obviously that does take resources. But people who are really willing to take action will take action. For example, I went to Sheffield to exhibit the documentary, and one of the conversations that I had with a lady there was the fact that if Grenfell happened in Sheffield, there would be there would be riots, right? She was just like, we know how to do this, you know. We are like the social class, working class here, so that could not run. She was just like, no, Sheffield would be shut down. And, you know, it's stuff like this, like enabling those dialogues happening like in different places in the UK is so vital. But I think when it comes to representation, just literally sitting down with people and, you know, the conversation face to face is very essential. This is an essential way of communication. But I think what it boils down to is just your internal ethics, where it's just one-to-one. That's it.
Great. We're going to have to wrap up there. I would suggest, we've got some flyers down here for the London Renters Union. If you want to know more about the London Renters Union and get involved, I would suggest going to the Silent March on the 14th of every month for the Grenfell United. And if you wanted to know, I'd follow Notes from Below on Twitter to get all of their information, so you can get their journals. They're amazing, they're super interesting, their website's brilliant. And you can follow the struggles that IWGB are fighting for on Twitter as well. So thank you all for coming and missing the football. And yeah.
What's the score?
It's 2-0.
2-0.
Oh.
Wait, so did we win? Are we winning?
There we go. Football's coming on.